So good morning, afternoon, possibly evening to some participants. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which we've titled Returning to the Principles of Good Randomized Clinical Trials. The webinar is brought to you today by the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative and the Global Health Network are providing the platform for us at the University of Oxford. My name is Rachel Hallett. I'm the Capacity Strengthening Manager for the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, which we'll refer to now as the Collaborative, or GCTC for short. So our overall aim in today's session is to introduce you to the work of the Collaborative, which was established in 2020. The aim is to develop and promote the adoption of new guidance to enable better randomized clinical trials, or RCTs. We have a panel of expert speakers from diverse areas of the RCT world today who'll provide their perspectives on the guidance, how it relates to initiatives to improve RCTs in the locations and the organisations they represent. So before I introduce our speakers and their agenda, the running order, there are some housekeeping items that I need to make you aware of. Firstly, the session is being recorded and it will be shared in the coming weeks on the Global Health Network platform, so you can review it and hopefully share it within your networks. We're fortunate to have translators with us today. The webinar will be held in English and there'll be simultaneous translation into Spanish, Portuguese and French. So to use this feature, you can navigate to the toolbar as it shows on your screen now, there to the interpretation feature and select your preferred language. Due to the number of participants here, your videos and microphones have been disabled. So please use the chat feature if you'd like to introduce yourself or report any technical issues. We have the Global Health Network team behind the scenes to help you with those. You can use the Q&A feature to post your questions and comments throughout the session, and you can post anonymously if you wish. We would really like to hear from you, so please do post in the Q&A feature. In this way. We have dedicated time allocated for questions and answers, so we'll try to get through as many questions as we can, and if we don't have time for all questions, we'll compile them and address them later on. We'll let you know throughout how to contact us, and please do post your email addresses if you would like us to contact you. We'd really like to keep the conversation going with you after the webinar has ended. So I'm really delighted to be joined today by our speakers who together represent really an enormous breadth and depth of experience and expertise in the field of clinical trials across different settings and roles. I'll introduce them in a little bit more detail before they speak, but to highlight where they're from and the agenda, the running order for today, we'll first hear from Professor Sir Martin Landray, who's our senior lead at the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative. And he'll be really introducing you to the rationale for the development of and the promotion of the collaborative's guidance. We'll then hear from Dr. Thomas Nyirenda and Ms. Michelle Nderu from the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, or EDCTP. They're based in South Africa. And they're going to talk to us about the role of the guidance in strengthening the clinical trials ecosystem in Africa. We'll then have a recorded presentation. Unfortunately, Dr. Cristina Torres is unable to be with us live today. She's a professor of social sciences from the National Institutes of Health, University of the Philippines in Manila. So she's provided us her thoughts and insights on the value of the guidance in supporting her work in research ethics committee review and decision making. We'll have a bit of time, I hope, then for Q&A, and we'll build that into the agenda. And then our final speaker of the day is Dr. Netzahualpilli Delgado Figueroa, and he's the Director of Health Research at the Secretaría de Salud, Jalisco, Mexico. He's going to talk to us with his role in the Global Health Network's Latin America and the Caribbean Hub, one of the newest hubs, I understand, in the work that they're going to do in conjunction with us to promote the principles of good RCTs using the guidance. And Netza will also briefly flag up our next webinar. Fantastic. Okay, so this, the Global Health Network have just provided us with the attendees today, and it's wonderful to see such a fantastic spread across the globe. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, particularly for those of you who I understand are in a particularly early part of the morning over in Latin America. So thank you. We have a couple of websites here. I'd direct you first of all to our website at the collaborative, goodtrials.org. That's where you can contact us, sign up to receive our newsletter, and continue the conversation with us after the webinar. The Global Health Network platform is here for those of you who are new to it. And similarly, when we discuss the guidance, you can go to our website. The final link here is showing you where you can download it in several different languages. Okay, so I think we'll move on now. Thank you very much for the initial slides there. So we'll move to our first speaker now, Professor Sir Martin Landray. So as well as being our senior lead at the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative and the initiator of the collaborative, Martin is a professor of medicine and epidemiology at the University of Oxford in the UK and a consultant hospital physician. He's also CEO of PROTAS, which is a not-for-profit organisation that aims to combine smart RCT design with the effective use of data, technology and collaborations to deliver cost-effective trials. Martin has over 20 years' experience in leading large randomised trials, and he's the co-principal investigator of the recovery trial of treatments for COVID-19. So I'll hand over to you now, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and very good to be with you all. So I really wanted to set the scene and then go through the principles that we've established as a part of a very large collaborative effort around what makes a good randomized clinical trial. The work is supported by the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, and started pre-pandemic back in late 2019 and continues as we go forward. So if I could have the next slide, please. It's worth thinking about the context. As you have heard just now, among other things, I'm a clinician, and I start often with the clinical context. And that is that we really need reliable evidence from clinical trials. It's essential for making the right decisions about the harms and the benefits associated with any health intervention, whether that's a drug, a vaccine, a surgical device, and so on and so forth. And that's important because there are so many decisions we end up having to make in the absence of reliable evidence, either because the trials weren't done, they weren't done well, they failed to publish the results, they were inconclusive. And that's bad medicine. That's bad for individual patients, individual clinical decision making, and it's bad for public health, vaccine policies, therapeutic policies, drug licensing, and so much more besides. So we go to the next slide. So if reliable evidence from randomized trials is so important, here are three challenges. The first is it's expensive. It's expensive and cumbersome. Clinical trials now cost, say, for example, for a new drug, a new vaccine in COVID, as an example, some of those trials cost in the order of $1 billion. That's a problem. And one component of the rising cost is the growth in the contract research organisation. It's not the only one. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with the outsourcing model, but a model which drives profit on the basis of time and materials plus a margin that rewards complexity is not necessarily the right approach for the public health challenges we face. We move to the next slide. We can see that much of the evidence that's produced is unreliable. So the trials that were done in COVID, this is an analysis from Janet Woodcock, who's just last week retired as the Chief Deputy Commissioner at the FDA after 30 plus years of experience there. She looked at the nearly 3,000 clinical trials in COVID and found that only 5% of them were randomized and adequately powered. In other words, 95% of those clinical trials were doomed to failure from the moment that someone wrote the protocol. That's bad medicine, that's bad research. Next slide, please. The third challenge is this problem of absent evidence. If you look across fields which are well known for being, if you like, evidence-based, cardiovascular medicine being a good example, then 85% of the recommendations in big international guidelines in cardiovascular medicine are not based on good evidence from randomized trials. So if the trials are not done, or they're not done well, if the results are not published, then that threatens both the reliability of the medicine and the way we practice it, but also, I would say, it threatens the trust that people may put in medicine and those who are making medical decisions at an individual or a public health level. Now, next slide. A number of other organisations and initiatives have recognised the challenge. These are three fairly recent ones. The G7 100 Days Mission was published in 2021 what was at the time thought to be the back of the pandemic, although of course that continued for a number of months and years after that, and really made the statement: we should refocus regulatory guidelines on the fundamental scientific and ethical principles that underpin randomized trials, embracing flexibility and innovation. And that's a theme I might come back to several times, that it's principles that matter, because the operational detail will vary depending on context. And it's also worth remembering that it's easy to regulate on the basis of the experience of what has gone well and not well in the past. But actually, and the pandemic really illustrated this, what we need is principles that will stand the test of time, that we can apply to the future, where different types of drugs will be coming forward, different types of diseases, different context in terms of where the trials are being conducted, and in terms of where the clinical care will then be given. So I've emphasised the G7, but that same message is really taken up by the World Health Assembly and then into the WHO. It's taken up by the White House in the United States and many others besides. We go to the next slide. So there really is an opportunity. So the existing guidelines don't really establish what does good look like with regards to randomized trials. They focus a lot on the sort of operational detail, who should sign which piece of paper, where it should be stored, and where you should send the photocopy to, but they don't go to the heart of what makes a good randomized trial. And that was our ambition when we started off with the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, as I say, now just over 4 years ago. Next slide, please. So what is the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative? I've already said that it's funded by Wellcome and Gates. It's a global community initiative, and really was set out to look at what were the key principles, what was the key standards in terms of science, of ethics, efficiency and quality. What does good look like? We move to the next slide. It's a very diverse multidisciplinary group, both the original writing group and all the various organisations with whom we've consulted or that we have had input from through feedback to public engagement activities and the like. So it's diverse in different ways. Which part of the world do people come from? Are people interested in new drugs, or are they interested in existing medicines? Are people interested in prevention, or are they interested in treatment? Which diseases are they interested in? But it's also diverse in terms of skills: statisticians, clinicians, regulators, and pharma, drug developers, health policy makers, funders of research, and so on and so forth. And key among all that is also public and patient advocates and representatives of various kinds, all with different contexts, with different experiences, but all with something to add to that question of what does a good trial, a good randomized trial look like. Next slide, please. So since we originally put the guidance together, we have done a number of public consultation activities and a number of additional consultations, in particular as highlighted here with lowering income countries, where the common themes that came out were the challenges, which are different in places. They're different in every place, but particularly they're different between the global south and the global north. The importance of community engagement comes through particularly strongly, and the importance of gathering the participants or the patient's point of view, remembering, of course, that not all participants in trials will consider themselves patients. Next slide, please. So what does good guidance look like? And this was one of the very first slides we put together back 3 or 4 years ago. And I think it's reasonable to test that good guidance will focus first on the good science and ethics. So what issues will materially influence the well-being of the people who are in your trial and the reliability of the results, which of course will influence one way or another many more people who are not in your trial, but will be treated or not treated as a consequence. The second thing about good guidance is that it has to be clear and concise. It's easy to write more, but the more you write, and on the whole, the more restrictive you become. What we want is something that promotes critical thinking and helps good decisions. The third is a point I've already outlined, which is that the guidance needs to be inclusively developed with all of those different perspectives, as I've suggested. And finally, the guidance needs to be progressive and durable. It's not about writing rules for today, it's writing principles that are true today, that were true yesterday, were true when the first modern randomized trials came about in the 1940s, and will likely be true when there's the next generation trial in the next few decades. Next slide, please. So we really have focused on the why. Why should we be doing particular actions? Not who should do them, what they should do, where they should write it down, or how they should do them. That, of course, will always vary. So emphasizing the key principles, recognizing, and I think this is important, that many trials pose little or no additional risk to participants compared to normal clinical practice. They don't actually take much more skills than being, if you like, a normal clinical practitioner. So recognizing these in context, allowing the trialists to determine the most efficient and effective solutions that will allow people to be engaged in those clinical trials. It's a sort of accessibility issue, if you like. Discouraging excessive or defensive practices, and noting, and this is, I think, important, that documentation is not the same as quality. And what we were interested in is quality. Next slide, please. So our guidance has come up with a number of, with 5 key principles, which are outlined on the right, and I'll come back to in a moment. But really what we've been thinking about is the design characteristics, the ethical responsibilities, and the behaviours that will develop trust between different people involved. A clinical trial needs to be fit for purpose, fit for its purpose in its context. And of course, then the information and the way the trial is conducted and coordinated needs to be such that it provides effective quality and high quality decision making all the way through. So if we go to the next slide, just a little bit about those 5 principles. So the first principle is that good randomized clinical trials produce a scientifically sound answer to a relevant question. Now, there are a dozen sub-principles in there, which range from making sure that one thinks about the right population, not too restrictive, but also perhaps not too general. Thinking about how one allocates the treatment, the randomization process, about size, all the way through to adherence and follow-up, and then thinking about how one might analyze that trial and how one might adapt that trial depending on emerging information that is accruing from other sources. The second principle is about that good randomized trials respect the rights and well-being of participants. Now, that's more than lip service. That's about making sure that there is proper communication that will drive proper consent. That if people change their minds, they change consent, that those changes are then acted upon. That think about actually the safety of the individuals and the communication of new information during the trial and beyond the trial back to the people who take part in the trial. The third is about that good randomized clinical trials are collaborative and they're transparent. This is about working with patients and communities, and you can define communities in a whole variety of ways. It's about collaboration among different organizations. Most clinical trials require collaboration between local communities, between pharma, between academia, between funders, between government organizations, and transparency. The fourth principle is that good randomized trials are designed to be appropriate for their context. Different contexts, primary prevention, secondary prevention, vaccines versus drugs, higher income settings, low income settings, rural versus urban, and so on and so forth. Different ability to use existing resources. And finally, that good randomized trials manage the quality efficiently and effectively so that there can be competent decision making, the trial integrity can be protected, and that one's really planning for success, focusing in on the issues that matter. Next slide, please. So if we've just moved. Thank you very much. Here is an example just to give you a flavour of the layout. Rather than setting down a set of rules, each part of the guidance, each sub-principle, if you like, has a section on what's the key measure, key message, and a section which highlights why this is important. And the aim of the guidance is not to tell people what to do, but to help people to think about what they should do. If we move to the next slide, please. We're currently having produced this guidance. It's all available on our website in 6 different languages, including those covered on the in the translation service today. We are working with the ICH to ensure, or at least encourage, that these principles are adopted and adapted for the ICH Good Clinical Practice Guidelines. At present, from what we've seen, there's nothing that's a straightforward conflict, although there is certainly room for improvement within even the draft revision of GCP guidance from ICH. We go to the next slide, please. We are working with the WHO as they look at their guidance for best practices for clinical trials, and the draft guidance that was put out by the WHO. The first section of that is very much based on the principles from the GCT collaborative, which I've just shown you. Next slide, please. We also have an additional welcome grant to support a project we call PRISM, which is aiming to promote the principles of good randomized trials and to develop pathways to implementation with key stakeholders in each region. And Rachel's leading that work, and we can address questions or provide further information if you're interested. Next slide. And our feeling is that these guidance can be used at different stages of the process, whether one's developing a new protocol and trial idea, whether one's seeking funding, or indeed sitting on a funding panel. What does good randomized trial look like? Whether participating in a trial, conducting it, actually whether one's regulating a trial, and whether one's implementing the results. The question is this trial that might happen, is happening, or has happened, is it a good randomized trial? And it's reasonable to test that question by referring back to those principles. So finally, if we return to the principles that I've highlighted, next slide, please. The Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, which has had very broad, far-reaching input to establish what are these 5 principles of good randomized trials, has established the idea that these good randomized trials are informative and relevant, they respect the participants, they're collaborative and transparent, they're designed to be appropriate for their particular context, and they're efficient and well managed. Those 5 principles in headline and the 27 sub-principles that are in the detailed document really will drive an improvement in the conduct of randomized clinical trials, and consequently improvements in the delivery of healthcare, whether at an individual patient level or at a public health and decision-making level. Next slide. It simply remains for me to say thank you to all of you for listening. Here are the contact details, and there is much more on our website, including the guidance, as I say, in 6 languages, free to download or to browse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. That's a really important grounding we've had there in why the guidance is important, why it was needed, how it was developed, and our ambitions for its future use. So we're going to pass on now to the next speaker, or 2 speakers, who are going to share this session. Dr. Thomas Nyirenda and Michelle Nderu. Tom is the Strategic Partnerships and Capacity Development Manager, Head of Africa Office at EDCTP, based in South Africa. He's a public health physician and research scientist with huge experience in planning and implementing community disease control programs, operational research and clinical trials. And he's a member now of several committees of agencies that are supporting clinical research and capacity development in Africa. Michelle is a project officer at EDCTP. She trained as a molecular biologist and holds a master's in medicine, and she's managing the EDCTP Fellows Alumni Network, along with the Regional Networks of Excellence programme and several collaborative pharmacovigilance and health systems strengthening projects. So we're looking forward to hearing their perspectives on the guidance in the initiatives that they're involved with. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I hope you can hear me. And thanks for the kind introduction. Really, we are glad to be involved, myself and my colleague Michelle, because EDCTP has just clocked 20 years of operations in sub-Saharan Africa. And this guidance comes at the right time when we really, really need it. And the contents in it really emphasize one thing, and that we need to do this really constructively and together collaboratively. Because there are two issues here. There's the issue of improving quality on one side, and as Professor Landray says, there's an issue of meeting the agency, so speed on the other side. And that has made us think a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, and we have been privileged at EDCTP that since last year, we have been having a series of meetings with a lot of partners in sub-Saharan Africa to see what we can do. And what comes out very clearly is that whether it's the guidance from the collaborative or the guidance from WHO, which I'm glad they both speak to each other, there's really need for a good coordination mechanism. And what you see in front of you is part of the work that we have done collaboratively with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, AUDA NEPAD, Africa CDC, WHO Afro in Africa, to bring together partners to brainstorm what this coordination mechanism could be so that we are able to implement the guidances as they are being crafted today. We in Africa, we think we have 7 areas of what we call the clinical trial ecosystem. And these 7 areas include clinical trial design, which have been touched on by Professor Landray. Capacity development is key. And development of networks and networks of networks, the third one, is very important as well. Then comes the issue of AI and digital technologies that needs to be thought together. But all this cannot happen without financing, which is the 5th point. And then we have regulation and ethics oversight that also needs attention. And lastly, not forgetting community engagement. So if we are going to think about what kind of coordination mechanism needs to be put in place, this slide just summarizes what has come through from different consultations, that we have 3 areas that we really need to coordinate, and these are systems. Secondly, the people, the scientists, policymakers, etc. And thirdly, the infrastructure. And the coordination mechanism comes in between. And for us, we have the luck of having the Africa CDC behind the system, and also with other partners of the Africa CDC, AUDA NEPAD and WHO Afro being at the center of it. So when you talk about the African response, this is what we think is going to work. And it may not work, but I think if we put into practice, probably it will be a best response to the guidance that has been established. So my colleague, Michelle Nderu, who is on the ground, is now going to talk to us about what we are trying to do in terms of quality and coordination at the implementation level. Let me hand it over back to you, Rachel. No, Michelle is online. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Tom. So as EDCTP Africa office within the 3rd program of EDCTP, we have functioning in two main priority areas, amongst others. And the first area that we're working in is we're trying to invest in enhancing capacity building and coordination of clinical trials within the ecosystem, as has been called upon by the WHA in 2022. And the second area is we're trying to work on improving the quality and efficiency of clinical trials conducted in Africa. So EDISTP has been focusing on building capacity and strengthening collaboration since the first program was established in 2003. But before we could invest in enhancing coordination and collaboration, we had to identify existing barriers to collaborative clinical research in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, some of the barriers that were identified was that we noticed that there was a weak South-South collaboration, which led to inadequate support for capacity building to nurture research talent. We also noticed that there's historical bias in South-North collaboration, in that we found that there were some countries or sites that were mainly working with Northern partners with colonial links, and this excluded potential researchers and sites. Thirdly, we also noticed that researchers were working in silos, they were working in isolation, and this limited collaborative potential and impact. And lastly, there was limited sharing of rare facilities and expertise, which hindered the collective resource utilization. So to address all these barriers, in 2009, the EDISTP established 4 geographically defined regional consortia of institutions that covered South, East, West, and Central Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the aim was to support regional networking and collaboration in Sub-Saharan Africa and with Europe in order to build and strengthen regional, national, institutional, and individual capacities to conduct clinical trials in line with international good clinical practice. So to date, these networks cover 30 Sub-Saharan countries, and they are working with 7 northern partners, and they are a total of 60 institutions which are part of the networks. So to date, these networks have conducted a baseline burden of disease studies so as to prepare them for conducting future clinical trials. Together with EDISTP, we've invested substantially in clinical trial infrastructure and in cross-cutting short-term training, long-term training, and also in field mentorships to produce networked and highly skilled African researchers. And also one of the achievements to date is that these institutions within each of the network of excellence they have learned to collaborate in joint proposal development and project implementation. Now, secondly, I mentioned that an area that we're working in is improving quality and informativeness of clinical trials. Now, as a funder, we have the responsibility to ensure that the trials that we fund are of high quality and are likely to be informative so that we can maximize our return on investment. And in so doing, EDISTP Africa Office has partnered with DAC and DAC Africa. This is Design, Analyze, Communicate programs. They do have a secretariat in Seattle, and they also have a secretariat in Africa. So DAC Africa mainly focuses on African clinical trials and works with African clinical trial experts. And the aim of these 2 programs is to optimize the informativeness and impact of global health clinical research. Now, they do this by providing a comprehensive protocol design review via a team of experienced clinical trial experts who optimize your chances as a grantee or a potential grantee, you optimize your chance to, conducting a successful clinical trial. And they do this by improving your study planning, by using current best practices for clinical research that focus on 3 critical areas of study planning, and that is design, analysis, and communication. Now, as EDISTP, our role in the partnership is to disseminate the tools and to promote the program. So I'd like to encourage you to visit their website that hosts most of their tools and assets. Please feel free to go in, browse around and see what will work for you and your project. And also feel free to reach out to the DAC team. The contacts are there. The DAC Africa team contact is also reflected on this slide. I've also again reflected the DAC website and the tools, and please also feel free to reach out to the EDCTP Global Health 3 website that lists all our calls for proposals that are currently open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both. That's fantastic to hear that about EDCTP and being at the heart really of all of those multi-agency initiatives to bring stakeholders together. We look forward to exploring a role for the guidance there in your ongoing work. Thank you also for introducing DAC to the audience, Michelle, and a body that we have been in conversation with and have many ideas that are aligned with the guidance, particularly in terms of improving informativeness of trials. Thank you very much. So we're going to hear now from Cristina Torres. As I said, this is going to be a recorded presentation. And Cristina is a leading researcher in the field of social science and ethics in clinical and public health interventions. And since 2004, she served as coordinator of the Forum for Ethical Review Committees in Asia and the Western Pacific, or FERCAP, which is an advocacy and training group, as she will describe in the video. Thank you. If we can play the video now.
Good day, everyone. My name is Cristina Torres, and I am a social scientist and a FERCAP coordinator. Today, I will speak about the role of research ethics committees towards implementation of the principles of good clinical trials collaborative. FERCAP is the biggest network of research ethics committees in Asia. We were initiated as a project of the World Health Organization Special Program for Diseases Related to Poverty in the year 2000. We conduct capacity building of member research ethics committees through our training programs. We certify ethical compliance with good clinical practice and WHO ethical guidelines through voluntary audit of research ethics committees, and so far we have visited 278 research ethics committees as of 2023 across the Asia-Pacific region. We hold an annual international conference to update our members and other research stakeholders about new ethical guidance and research initiative. Through our FERCAP recognition program, the objective of which is protection of human research participants, we do voluntary audit of research ethics committees according to the following principles. First, standard is that they should have appropriate structure and composition. Then they should have standard operating procedures that adhere to international and local guidelines. We look at the completeness of their initial review process and their post-approval review and monitoring procedures, and this is where the principles of GCTC are very relevant. And finally, we also look at good documentation and archiving of the Research Ethics Committee. The principles of GCTC are very well applicable to the research ethics committees. 1. We look at the elements of ethics review towards the protection of human participants. So we check the scientific soundness of the protocol, and that could very well comply with the principle of being informative and relevant in GCTC. At the same time, we look at the ethical compliance of the protocol and the informed consent process, and that should include the principles of good risk assessment as well as benefit sharing, looking at vulnerable participants and protecting them, and all of this are found in the informed consent document. So that complies with the characteristic of being respectful of participants. Third, we look at the GCP compliance of the sponsor, the investigator, and the Research Ethics Committee. This would comply with being collaborative and transparent, as each stakeholder should manifest good practices related to good clinical trials. Then, the Ethics Committee looks at the site feasibility, and that will comply with having the appropriate context for good clinical trials. And finally, we look at compliance with the approved protocol to ensure that there is efficient and good management during the implementation of the clinical trial. So, there are potential benefits of the GCTC guidance to ethics review. Once the indicators are properly defined, the principles will enrich ethics review of clinical trials. It will improve ethics review of social value, scientific soundness, and ethical compliance, which are the good characteristics that we look for in the protocol documents. It will also ensure the feasibility of clinical trial through adherence by sponsors, researchers, and Research Ethics Committee, and encourage collaboration and good community participation to achieve efficiency during implementation of clinical trials. It will improve compliance with enhanced protocol by making clinical trials more efficient and practicable, and it will result in better human research protection. So finally, the success of GCTC guidance will depend on the support and commitment by research stakeholders, sponsors, researchers, research ethics committees, and regulators to ensure good implementation of clinical trials. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. And we'd like to thank Cristina for her time to spend considering where the alignments have occurred, or where she's found alignments between the efforts and the activities of the FERCAP audit and the FERCAP group there, and looking at that, how that aligns with our principles. And again, we're hoping very much to explore that a bit further. So in a very different context setting than that described by Tom and Michelle. So hopefully this is giving you a flavour of this broad applicability and the usefulness, as we hope, of the guidance across multiple stakeholders and multiple regions. So we have a little bit of time now for any Q&A. I'm not seeing any coming through at the moment. I'll just check with my colleagues. So has anybody got any comments? It doesn't have to be a question or any particular reflections on the guidance. Okay, so now I can see your questions come in here. Thank you very much. So I'll read it out. How does the EDCTP and FERCAP interact with country-specific government agencies? Does it have power or say in each individual country to influence how trials are conducted, or is advice given but there's no legal obligation from each country to follow this? Okay, so I think we'll have to direct that to the EDCTP representatives here and maybe save that up to ask Cristina and feedback to you. Thank you for asking the question. And perhaps Tom and Michelle, can you give us a little bit of an insight into how EDCTP interact with country-specific government agencies?
No, thanks very much for that question. It's really important. First of all, to say that EDCTP as a funder doesn't have its own regulations governing the conduct of clinical trials internationally, but we are obliged to fund only trials that meet international agreed upon recommendations. So ICH, GCP, or other ethical international guidances. There are some that are regional or local, and anything that makes the trial be as ethical as possible is what we subscribe to. But we do work with in-country organizations by firstly alignment. So EDCTP is a partnership, a public-public partnership. Within the governing board of EDCTP, there's 44 countries. Now, out of those 44 countries, 28 countries are sub-Saharan African countries, and the other 16 countries are European. And these are, the board is constituted of individuals that have been tasked by their governments to represent EDCTP on the governing board. Some are, so if I talk about sub-Saharan Africa, some would be from ministries of health, others would be from ministries of research, etc., depending on what the country sees fit. And these are our owners of the program, and our scientific advisory committees and other bodies that are really scientific just help in putting together what we call a business plan and also annual EDCTP work plans. And they are approved by the General Assembly of 44 countries as a way forward and a way to go. So it is really a program that whose ownership rests on individual governments and their partners. And we are, so to say, just an executive board. So I hope that clarifies that we don't have rules of our own. We really just subscribe to international good practices and ensure that all the clinical trials that we fund or capacity building programs we fund meet those recommendations. I don't know, Michelle, whether you have any additions to that.
Thank you, Tom. No additions. I think you've responded quite well. You've captured the main points that needed to be expressed. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that's answered. Yes, so truly collaborative with government figures also involved in the EDCTP itself. Thank you. Thank you for posing that question there. Do we have any others coming in the Q&A? Perhaps we could move Louis to show the slide then, because I guess if you're still thinking about questions and comments, we'd quite like to pose question to you as the attendees. We'd really like to make this webinar a two-way exchange of knowledge. So what we'd like to ask really is for your reflections on what you've heard so far, now that you've been introduced to the collaborative's guidance and have heard some perspectives on potentially where and how it might be deployed or find use in other global initiatives. Do you think the collaborative's guidance would enhance the way RCTs are conducted from the perspective of your own role or setting? And another question, the principles are written in a very broad way to make them applicable across all settings, and hopefully you'll have a chance to explore those a little bit more, as Martin said, on our website. Have you any ideas about how they could be brought into everyday practice? So we recognise that the benefit will be seen only when we're actually bringing the guidance into people's work practices. So these are just a couple of questions to pose to you. We'd love to hear from you now or after the webinar if you'd like a little bit more time to reflect on these. All feedback is helpful for us, positive and negative, and our website again is there where you can contact us, sign up to our newsletter, and help us to think about ways in which we can move forward with implementing the guidance. Okay. So in the interest of keeping to time then, I will leave you with those questions to ponder perhaps, and I think we'll move over. I'll just check, we've got no other questions coming in. We'll hear from our last speaker then, so we're crossing the globe again. We're going to speak to Dr. Netzahualpilli Delgado Figueroa. Netza is an experienced physician and health researcher. He has a particular focus on community health and evidence-based medicine. He holds roles as a researcher and teacher at the University of Guadalajara and as a pediatric in ER medicine physician. And he's also coordinating our link between the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative and the Global Health Network's Latin America and Caribbean Hub, which is part of the PRISM project that Martin mentioned in his talk. So he's going to give us a brief overview of the work that we're doing together. And how the LAC Hub will be helping to promote the guidance in that region. Thank you, Netza.
Thank you, Rachel. You hear me? Hello, everyone. Well, as part of the overview of the work of GCTC and the Global Health Network, one of our main objectives for the Latin American Caribbean region is to support regional research and ecosystem and prioritize the collaborative, informative, and efficient research responses to public health challenges. And we expect to create a network and also strengthen the capacity and policy advocacy and training and communication. And one of the main actions is to create workshops, webinars like this, and training courses to promote and share the knowledge of best practices through Latin American Caribbean region, just like we're doing here. And also we recognize that one of our main barriers are the language, because a lot of the guidance and also webinars and materials and communications to do better research, most of them are restricted to only English language. So one of our main objectives is to deliver this information and these materials and workshops to everyone who are interested to doing clinical research. And most of this content is expected to be translated to Spanish and Portuguese, because we expect that all Latin American and Caribbean can collaborate with these initiatives. And also we are planning to do during this year workshops, webinars, communications, and also right now we have an Spanish updated version of the Good Clinical Trial guidance. So with this link, we expect that everyone who are speaking Spanish can check this guidance and apply in the context of research. Next slide, please. And these actions are supported by the implementation of a strategy to enhance the collaboration and outreach researchers, early career professionals, regulators, and ethics committees to promote high quality RCT principles. Also, we are mapping and identifying stakeholders who are involved in the RCTs in the LAC region. So everyone who is interested in doing clinical research and also the people who are already running clinical trials in the regions, please contact us to reach and also be part of this network that we expect to strengthen all the clinical trials in the LAC region. And also we want to share that we are planning to design and distribute informational material of RCT's best practices. This is part of the collaboration of the GCTC and the Global Health Network, Latin America Hub. Please, the next slide. So we expect with this collaboration of Good Clinical Trials and the Global Health Network Latin America and Caribbean Hub, we expect to impact on researchers, patients and consumers, students, professors, and early career professionals, institutional review boards, regulators, ethics committees, and of course, the funders and the sponsors. We expect to create a network in the Latin America that can collaborate with the other networks around the world. And one of the main objectives is to reach these people with a value of a guidance that is very comprehensive, and it's also very useful to evaluate projects. So we have a guidance that is useful for everyone, the ones who want to conduct clinical trials, and want to design the protocol, the people who are checking if these protocols comply with the regulations, the local and the international ones, and also for the students and professors who are teaching about clinical trials in the respective universities. It's a great resource for teaching, and also we expect that the funders and sponsors, just like the other speakers expressed, we expect that the funders look for this guidance and check for the compliance of the projects, and we expect to have more research that comply with the regulations and good clinical practices. The next one, please. Well, the surprise that we expect to have a lot of work this year, and our next webinar in the LAC region is expected to be held during the spring of this year. So please follow us in the website, in the Latin America hub of the Global Health Network, and also the website of GCTC Collaborative. So thank you so much for the attention and also being here. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Netza. That's fantastic. And yes, a lot of work to do. And we appreciate everyone who's attending from the TGHN LAC Hub and who would like to join us. And as Netza's mentioned, many conversations that we'd like to have with stakeholders in that region. I can see we have some really fantastic questions coming in now, and unfortunately we are a little bit running out of time. I just wanted to perhaps summarize 2 or 3 questions which have really highlighted ideas that are really important in terms of translating the guidance into everyday life, in providing context for it so that people can interpret it in their own settings and situations and role types, and to provide specific examples that people can use to see what we mean by the high-level principles. So I just wanted to mention that those are activities that we are very much involved with in producing tools, in producing educational material that we hope to be rolling out soon. And we'd very much, again, value feedback from this audience on those in the way that we try to bring the guidance into people's everyday practices. So that's hopefully will answer a little bit some of those questions there. There are 2 or 3 others that are very specific, and I'm wondering if the people who've asked them would mind leaving their email so that we can actually spend a bit of time replying to those after the webinar has finished, as we've only a minute to go. But thank you very much for your engagement, and we will be in touch, I hope. So I think we'll have to close here. I hope you found it an enlightening and thought-provoking session. I'd like to thank very much the Global Health Network, the team behind the scenes there who've helped us very much today in hosting the webinar, providing us with the platform and their technical expertise. I'd like to thank very much the speakers for all of their contributions and for making this webinar session today, and to all of you for your participation as well. And thank you so much for joining us, many of you from different parts of the world and at different times of the day. So thank you for making the time, and we hope we'll see you again on another webinar soon. So I think we'll have to close the session now. Thank you very much.